I'd like to ask about a student who doesn't have national or international awards and is doing research in environmental science with a professor this summer. Okay, obviously good activity. If the student does not publish this, I guess the not essay, but like the article or the research, is there any hope of applying to the Ivy League schools this year? Okay, his grades are straight A's, leader of two clubs. There's a sport that's maybe D3 level, and ACT is 34 out of 36. I'd like to know if you have any suggestions. Okay, so first and foremost, I mean, obviously, like that's a very strong activity for the summer is doing research for environmental science. I would say if that's potentially the overall strategy that they're going for in terms of their possible major, I would go all in into it, which means in addition to the research they're doing this summer, if you can find volunteering or community service that shows a broader interest in that field, I think that would complement it really well because it would thematically show that they have a genuine passion for environmental issues, right? So if they can do some sort of environmental cleanup kind of issues or maybe activism, those are all things that would bode pretty well for the student. Now, obviously, it's sometimes difficult in terms of like getting research published because largely that's dependent sometimes on the mentor or the professor. There could be options to get something published potentially. What I sometimes have had students do before and they've done in the past is that even if it's not the research they do in the summer, if they can continue working with the mentor on a separate individual project that they can work on that's based on the methodologies they use, that might be something potentially that they can publish and they can still work on it, obviously during the summer, during the fall. If you're talking about Ivy League level schools, a 34 is probably on the lower end, I'll be honest, especially now that there's a sudden uptick in interest in terms of standardized testing scores. A 34 is probably on the low end. I would say if they can probably go ahead and take one more shot to try to get a 35 or 36, it would certainly be well worth it. Because if you were to look at the average scores reported by these schools typically will be reported in terms of 25th to 75th percentile. For many Ivy League level schools, a 34 will probably only put them in the 25th percentile, whereas a 35 or 36 is what you would need these days to be in the 50th or 75th, 75th percentile. So, you know, if they have in it to do one more shot, possibly this September or even October, that would still be in time for them to be able to kind of boost up their profile. Okay. So yeah, so I think there was a follow-up to that one. Is a 34 a good score? Depending on the schools, you know, obviously a 34 can be very competitive depending on the schools that you're applying to. But for a top 15 university, I would say try one more time to potentially get a higher equivalent, um, either through the SAT or the ACT. Okay. Next is if my major is not in environmental science, should I still participate in environmental science activities if I'm interested in the topic as a hobby? It still could be good, right? Potentially, because environmental science does have some carryover to some natural science activities as well. You would still be involved in like some bio and chem type activities. So it doesn't hurt, right? Now, of course, if there are other activities that you could do in the same time that's a little bit more tailored to your major, that might be a little bit better potentially, right? So yeah, so that certainly doesn't hurt at all. Now, of course, it also gives you the flexibility to maybe try for environmental science for some schools, especially if the schools do have certain programs that would be maybe potentially easier to get into for environmental science. Okay, next is when do you think is the best time to submit the college application? 2 weeks or 1 week? I would say 2 weeks at the bare minimum, right? So if you can do it 3 or 4 weeks before the deadline, that would be the best case scenario because what a lot of people don't tell you is that oftentimes for things like interviews, um, the earlier you can submit your application, the better your chances of getting an interview because then you're already in the database to be circulated to different interview chairs, right? So if you can submit an application usually in that window of like 3 to 4 weeks before the deadline, especially for early schools, I think that potentially will work in your favor because that also gives admissions people more time. They're not going to be as busy to go ahead and read your file. Now, of course, I do say that with a caveat of like, don't submit it if you don't think it's ready, right? So if you're going to turn in sloppy work 3 or 4 weeks, if you could have used the extra 2 weeks to put together better quality essays and the application in total, spend the extra time to get it right. But if like you're starting this early, if you're working during the summer, let's say you already gotten the prompts when they come out August 1st, and you can plan it right and spend enough time to put together solid applications, we normally advise our students to be able to submit it about 3 or 4 weeks before the deadline. So for the EAED deadline, ideally you would like to see your application in there by the first, maybe by the second weekend of October at the very latest. And for your RD schools, like your regular decision schools, you really want to be targeting first week of December, right? Second week at the very latest, right? You don't want to be cutting it close to the deadline because keep in mind, colleges also see the timestamp of when you submitted it, right? So if you're submitting it like the day before, or even worse, the day of the deadline, it sends a really bad signal that you're sort of a procrastinator a little bit, that you're not as on top of things as they would like you to be, right? So yeah, so at the end of the day, it makes a lot of sense for you to really plan things right and to be able to adhere to those deadlines as best you can, right? So the best way to do that is, of course, getting the help of an experienced counselor who can help you set those deadlines and expectations and help give you the confirmation that those applications are ready. Because what I've often seen is that students who might be, pretty good at writing essays, they keep second guessing themselves. So they keep making minor tweaks to the essay, even if it doesn't really improve it, because they're paranoid. They don't know if it's good enough and they keep working on it. Sometimes they make it worse, right? And they could have submitted it like a good 2 to 4 weeks earlier, but they simply didn't, right? So that's something to keep in mind.
Okay.
Okay.